Go. Okay. So we're going to be talking about the Berlin Conference today, and there are going to be a few things I want you guys to write down. But nothing from this slide. So if you want to just title a section of your notes, Berlin Conference, and I'm going to give you the background to it. I'm going to tell you what it was and then why it's important, like why it's so important today, what it has to do with boundaries, what it has to do with particularly superimposed boundaries. So like I said, if you were in group 8, you were in group 8, you were asked to choose a boundary in Africa that was created by the Berlin Conference. And just a little bit of background. So when we think about colonization, and we think about particularly European colonization, however, other countries throughout the world did colonize other regions of the world, we think about colonization in two major waves. The first wave of colonization was focused on North and South America. So we think about the Spanish in Latin America, we think about the Portuguese in Brazil, we think about the English and the French in North America. And that was really the first wave of colonization. The second wave of colonization really began in the late 1800s and was really focused on the colonization of Africa and Southeast Asia, as well as a few other parts of the world. And it did include colonization by the country of Japan in East Asia as well. But just a little historical background, you'll learn again about this Berlin Conference. You'll learn a lot more about colonization in world history next year. And by the way, I know you guys are starting to think a little bit about what classes to sign up for. If you have any questions about like where you think you should be for social studies next year, obviously people have asked me like, well, what's AP Human World History? And it's pretty much just the equivalent class. However, sophomores do take, the difference between AP Human and regular Human, and then AP World and regular World, is that everyone is a sophomore. Everyone takes 2 semesters of social studies. So like part of this AP Human is that this is a full year course and everyone else is just taking a quarter or like a semester. That's different for the rest of the time. So if you have any questions about it, you can ask me, or if you want to know like what would you suggest for me for next year, feel free to ask me. I'm probably going to tell you that you should take AP World, but we can have that discussion. Okay. So like I said, you're going to learn about this again. You're going to, sorry, I'm off track. So prior to the late 1800s, European colonizers traded, with the focus on Africa, was mostly through trade. So prior to the late 1800s, Europeans were on the coast of Africa mostly through trade, so through the slave trade, as well as trading of goods. And remember that many slaves were brought to the colonies of North and South America. In fact, millions of slaves were brought to the colonies of North and South America. And that was part of this concept of trade. But it really wasn't until the late 1800s that European colonizers started having more and more interest in Africa as a place to colonize. And the impetus of this was in 1876 when King Leopold of Belgium sent explorers to regions of the Congo River. And the information that came back talked about the vast resources within the continent. And that really led, by 1880s, Europeans to increase dramatically the interest that the awareness and the interest of Africa's valuable resources. And obviously a key component of colonialism is the exploitation of resources from colonies. So with that, the British, the Portuguese, the French, the Belgians, the Germans, as well as other European countries, really raced to control vast amounts of territory. There was tons of resistance, obviously, by the inhabitants of Africa, but at the time, and because of the way in which weaponry and other things had developed differently in Europe and Africa at the time, the many European powers had the ability and the to take control of many areas. So European powers between the European powers, though, they viewed this race to Africa with a lot of jealousy and suspicion. So you don't have to write down any of this. However, this next slide, I do want you to write once again, the Berlin Conference, and I want you to write down goal, and then I want you to write down this last. So the last 2 bullet points I think are going to be important. So because of this jealousy, this suspicion, and really because European powers at this point didn't really want to go to war with each other, the German chancellor, his name was Otto von Bismarck, you'll also hear more about him as a very influential figure in German history, but also just world history at the time, called 13 European countries and the United States to take part in a conference. And the goal of that conference was to work out a joint policy regarding the African continent. Now, you'll note here, it was 13 European countries and the United States, which, by the way, the United States did not actually take control of any land in Africa, okay? We were off colonizing other parts of the world, particularly Latin America, through indirect colonization, and Hawaii and other places. But you'll notice who's not at this conference. China is not at this conference. That is a really good point. But they did not consult any African nations, right? And so we have heard this time and time again, this concept of the boundaries of Africa being created by outside forces for the purposes of colonization, which doesn't take into account the actual interests of the people there. So what do we call boundaries like this? Superimposed boundaries, right? Superimposed boundaries. So it led to the colonial partitioning of Africa and the heightened colonial activity by European powers. And although it wasn't immediate, it wasn't overnight, in 1884, 1885 was when the conference concluded, but over the years then, the control of Africa was really, began this colonial period. And the map, how you guys doing on this? Let me know when you're ready to me to change the slide. So the map ended up looking like this. Sorry. I know some of you guys are finishing up still. And so and this is a map of 1914. 1914 is right on the eve of World War I. And a lot of this colonization and the imperialism leading up to World War I, this jealousy, this suspicion, was one of the main causes of World War I. But you can see in white here the actual boundaries today, except that we don't have South Sudan here. And then you can see the colonial territory. So many of these boundaries that we still see today were created at this conference, the division of land, and then the division into different colonies was also created throughout the colonial period. So we've talked about this before, and we focus on this during our culture unit. But as we take a look at just once again the vast diversity of Africa, so if I take a look at this, this map of Africa, and I take a look at just the language differences, the ethnic differences, this is just language map, but we could see ethnic differences. We can see that the people of Africa don't line up very well with the countries of Africa. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about irredentism, the concept that national groups, nations spill over into other countries, neighboring countries. We talked about Somali and the Somali people and the Somali-speaking people that don't just exist in the country of Somalia, but also spill over into the country of Kenya and Ethiopia, and how that concept can lead to a lot of conflict. It can lead to a lot of division. And it can lead to, just less of a cohesiveness within a country. So when we take a look at this, we can see that that's ultimately going to lead to many problems. And so I do want you to write down probably these last 3 bullet points, or actually, I don't know, you might want to summarize. I would say summarize portions of the last 4. This is available on Schoology as well. You'll have this prior to the test. But the results of this was that it created a bunch of different, many of them geometric boundaries. Not all the boundaries in Africa are geometric, but we find a lot more geometric boundaries in Africa than we do in really any other continent of the world. Those are those straight line boundaries that divided Africa into 50 plus irregular countries. Boundaries were superimposed over the thousands of indigenous groups and regions of Africa, and it divided some national groups while merging others. And we know that there's plenty of multinational countries, right? We're not going to have a country for every single national group. But the idea that people weren't consulted when placing national groups together into a country was problematic. You have maybe historical animosity between different ethnic groups, and now all of a sudden they're being placed in the same country. That's not going to work as well, unless as it would if the people were consulted. So created multiple multinational states, multi-state nations, irredentism, created several landlocked states. What's a landlocked state? Go ahead.
Sorry, a state that is not bordering any water.
Right. It doesn't have an outlet to the ocean. And why is being landlocked problematic? Yeah.
Because you can't bring in any resources from any other countries or anything through water and boats.
Right. So having access to the ocean is incredibly important with trade, right? And so if you're a landlocked country, that puts you in an economic disadvantage. It makes you reliant on other countries, because if you are going to ship goods out or bring goods in, you have to go through other countries. And so you'll have to have a very good relationship with your neighbors. And if you don't, your neighbors can use that against you. And so, yes, you may have a river route out to the sea, but those are going to be, that's going to be problematic, and that's going to put you in an economic disadvantage. And so the result was that these boundaries created over, 150 years ago, close to 150 years ago now, really are still today. So as countries of Africa went through a colonial period and ultimately became independent, many of those boundaries were used as the boundaries of the newly independent states. And so it led to centrifugal forces. It led to some weaknesses within those countries and even still today, the idea that these countries were created to serve as economic purposes of the colonizer, not the actual country, is problematic. Okay. So that's the Berlin Conference. And we think about that, the reason we talk about it in human geography, and you'll also talk about it in world history, but as you think about that for our purposes, it really links back to the ways in which boundaries are formed, but also those effects of those boundaries. Okay, so let me just double check. Oh yeah. So we're going to be now moving into some table group discussions. And so we are going to, I'm going to give you guys a table number. And so Grant, I'm going to have you move to this table right here. All right, so we spent a lot of time talking about boundaries the last 2 days, and then we also talked about boundaries. Actually, on Monday, you guys watched the video on boundaries at sea. Let's review really quick, if you guys remember. How many miles does your boundary go into the ocean? Whoa, that was fast. Yeah.
12 miles. However, if a boundary overlaps, they will each get 6 miles.
Good. How many miles does your boundary go into the ocean, guys?
10.
No. How many miles is your boundary going to the ocean? 12 miles. That means off the coast of Maine, right? 12 miles out from the coast of Maine is still U.S. territory. Okay? Then it's your EEZ. We're going to review this again. We're actually going to be doing an activity. Who did I talk to yesterday? I was so excited about the South China Sea. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that mess.
Yeah, that mess. Were you a part of that too? No. Okay. Yeah, next week we're going to talk about the South China Sea more specifically. And this will come back up again, so I don't just leave you with that video and be like, hey, memorize 12 miles, and then what the heck is an EEZ? That's 200 miles going out into the ocean, and that's what you're allowed to fish, and you're allowed to explore, and you're allowed to gather resources. Particularly, what's an important resource?
Oil.
Fish is really important though too. Yeah. Oil, yeah. Okay. All right, so we'll get into that more next week. But so we spent a lot of time talking about boundaries. My point was we spent a lot of time talking about boundaries, but so now we're gonna do our last thing, boundary follow-up discussion. You guys, so here's the questions. So I'm gonna stop the recording. I'll post these questions For those who aren't here on Schoology, have a